think we're ready to start. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the September edition of the monthly lecture series of Sprouts Environment Trust. We've been doing this lecture series for almost 7 years now, and we've had a great diversity of talks through these webinar lecture series. It used to be a physical lecture series where we used to have the speaker right in front of us earlier, but since the lockdown, we've had this opportunity, in fact, now to be able to invite international and long distance speakers also. So I think I look at it as a boon of sorts that now if we cannot fly either Mr. Pradip Krishen down or any of the other like Dr. Sahas Barve, who's speaking from the US, we can have Aparajita was talking from Bangalore. So we can have multiple speakers from various locations joining in for our webinar. So that's a boon in disguise. To introduce today's speaker, some of you must have definitely referred to his book on Trees of Delhi, which is a very, very popular, I think almost bestseller book, if I'm not wrong. And also the forest trees of central India, which is I have it sort of sitting right next to me almost all the time. It's absolutely like my pillow book it's a go-to absolutely must-have book for all people who step out into the wild. Pradip Krishen in the 1980s started as a filmmaker and has had a very great string of award-winning national international film awards. Mesi Sahib, which was in 1985, and then in which Annie Gives It to Those Ones in 1989, and Electric Moon in 1991. I would really recommend all of you all to absolutely have a look at them. Are they available on any of the OTT platforms, Pradeep?
Masi Sahib is, I think, and a version of Annie is available, but not a very good version.
Right. I'd seen it in the 90s in a college festival once, and it was quite fascinating. And then he broke out from his filmmaking career, and since 1989, he spent a lot of time with the trees and forests. And recently, he's also got enamored with the deserts, which he's going to talk to us about, especially the Thar Desert. So the third book, besides the Trees of Delhi and Jungle Trees of Central India, he has also written a book called Abha Mahal Bagh, A Garden of Wild Plants, which is a journal style. And currently he's working on a journal style book on the central ridge of Delhi, which is now being ravaged by so many developmental projects. So I think, I was just discussing with him the other day that we probably need to have a book like this about Bombay's trees and about Bangalore's trees, so many other city trees that are there. So we would definitely look forward to, partnering with you or taking advice from you as to how these books can be brought forward. But the other passion and great success that Pradeep has had is about rewilding of semi-desert and desert landscapes. So he has rewilded the Rao next to the Mehrangarh Fort in Jodhpur. He has rewilded the Rao Jodha Desert Park, Rock Park, and Kishan Bagh in Jaipur. So those of you who are from that area absolutely must visit, or if you ever are traveling to those parts, you must visit and have a look at how rewilding of desert areas. Now there's this big problem of people planting, doing plantations in deserts and completely destroying the deserts. So I think I'll hand it over to you, Pradeep, now. It's going to be a fantastic journey of a landscape very poorly understood by people, and we're changing it very, very fast. So thank you for accepting our invitation, and all over to you.
Thank you so much, Anand. I'm going to say just a few words and then I'm going to launch right into the presentation. It's obvious that I'm an aficionado of the desert. I've spent a lot of time traveling through the desert and getting to know it. And I wouldn't say that I know everything there is to know about the desert. There's lots that I don't understand and lots that I'm still unraveling and discovering. But the object of what I've tried to put together today is to try and share my sense of what I find most fascinating about the Thar Desert, or the Thar Desert as I've learned it's pronounced. So if I may, I'll just launch right into it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is essentially, sharing with you the complete diversity that you get in the desert of landforms, landscapes, plants, rocks, minerals. Some of you who have traveled in the desert will already be familiar with some aspects of the desert. Either you will have traveled in sandy areas that are, that have some kind of scrub in it, or maybe you'll have visited some rocky areas. But I want to extend that and give you a sense of, how whatever you've seen is probably only a small fraction of what there is to see in the desert. Just to be slightly pedantic, I want to just remind you of what we mean by the word landscape. We use it a lot. We use the word landscape loosely. For me, if you look at these two sentences, a largish area of countryside. Largish, of course, I say, although obviously, you can have a small landscape, and countryside, the word countryside is probably debatable. You can have a landscape, you can have an urban landscape, can't you? But the way we're using it in this presentation, and the way we tend to use it most often, is in terms of the countryside. And the two words that I've put down in yellow are the critical aspects of it. One, when we talk about a landscape, we're really talking about the way it appears, what it looks like. And we're looking, I think, especially at whether or not we find it aesthetically appealing, right? So these are two aspects of landscapes that we need to dwell on. But another way of looking at a landscape when you first come across a landscape is to use any one of these binaries, and perhaps other binaries that I haven't even thought of. You could ask, for example, whether the landscape that you're looking at, whether it's original or whether it's been altered, whether it's flat or whether it's hilly, whether it's primary or secondary, whether you find it attractive or whether it is something that is actually quite unappealing, whether it is a safe looking landscape or whether you find it somewhat frightening, whether it's wild or cultivated. So these are the kinds of binaries that actually help you to encapsulate the nature of the kind of landscape that you are looking at. I haven't tried to mine every single possible binary there is, but these are the kinds of questions that you can ask when you come across a landscape. Now, the Thar, or the Great Indian Desert, I'm saying Thar because all of us pronounce it Thar, don't we?
Yeah.
But I discovered by accident when I was talking to a man in Western Rajasthan, and I was asking him what they call the empty spaces. Do they have a word in Marwari to describe the empty spaces of the desert? He said, "Haan sahab, usko hum thar bolte hain." And I realized that thar, which is actually a mixture of the last consonant is a mixture of a d and a l, which some languages like Marathi, I think, has very much that sound as well. But for an Englishman to write thar, for him to reach for thar, but the way we read thar has become thar. But interestingly, I discovered recently that in Pakistan, when they talk about their part of the desert, they spell it thull, which is thar as well. So actually, it's not important, but the correct pronunciation of thar is actually thar. Now, 2 lakh square kilometers is what is currently believed to be the extent of the Thar desert, right? Of which 170,000 square kilometers is in India, and about 1 lakh square kilometers is in Rajasthan. The rest is either in southern Punjab or mostly in Gujarat. And just to give you a sense of how big this kind of expanse is, think of it like this, that the UK is only slightly bigger than the Thar desert. Greece is considerably smaller. Denmark, 5 Denmarks could fit into the Thar desert, and about 8 Belgiums could fit into the Thar desert. So it's actually rather a big expanse of land. Now, if you were to be able to go up into the sky and look down from a satellite into the dune fields of Jaisalmer district, what you'd find is something that looks like this. And what is immediately interesting and apparent about these pictures is that all the dunes that you see tend to be aligned in a particular direction, which is basically the direction in which the monsoon winds blow. And the dunes of the Thar Desert are particularly interesting and are particularly, very much a characteristic feature of certain parts of the desert. Now, these particular crescent dunes are Barkan or Barchan dunes. They're pronounced differently, but the word Barkan is actually from Kazakhstan and was coined by a Russian geologist, I believe. But this describes the particular kind of dune, essentially where the two arms on the sides of the dune, extend longitudinally in the same direction as the wind. So if you look at the wind blowing like this, can you see my cursor at all?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you see the wind blowing in this direction, the arms are actually extending in the same direction as the wind, with a much much steeper and a shallower, a steeper and a smaller slip face in the direction away from the wind, right? Then you also get Barkan dunes on Mars. And I included this picture just for fun because it was wonderful to see that even on another planet, because there is dust and because there is wind, you get exactly the same kind of landforms. You can see that in this case, you can see the wind is blowing in this direction from right to left. And other than the big, large Barkan dunes, you're also seeing all of the little Barkans, which are forming in between. Then you get the parabolic dunes, which are quite common in the Thar Desert. And the parabolic dunes, completely unlike the Barkans, have the arms trailing backwards. So they're pointing backwards in the direction from which the wind blows. And they tend to be called what are called blowout dunes. So you'll actually get if you look at the diagram at the bottom left, you'll see how a blowout actually occurs. And it'll happen essentially with winds that are not particularly steady, but winds that actually immediately cause a blowout. And the rest of the sand dune tends to be anchored by vegetation. And so do the arms, the backward pointing arms are also anchored. And these are very, very common also in the Thar Desert. Then you get what are called linear dunes, or safe. Safe is an Arabic word that is used to describe the kinds of lots of dunes that you get when the winds tend to be blowing more or less in the same direction, not strictly in one direction, but if you look at the arrows in the diagram at the bottom, they tend to be more or less pushing from one side. And that leads to these kind of long linear dunes, which again are very much a feature of the Thar Desert. And, look, there are lots of different, there are star dunes and dome dunes and other kinds of dunes, but I'm only giving you the main ones. And then you get what are called obstacle dunes. And this is something that you see again and again, whenever you see some of the hills, the Aravalli's courses through Rajasthan, sort of cutting it in two. Very often, wherever you see a hill, an obstruction, an eminence that is actually stopping the wind, you'll get what's called an obstruction dune. So here in this picture, you can actually see that the sand is piled up almost halfway up the height of the mountain. And these are also very, very interesting dunes because here you see what you tend to see is a huge contrast between the plants that grow in the sand and the plants that grow in rock. And they tend to be very different kinds of plants altogether. And I want to share with you something that I discovered about 3 or 4 years ago, and that is the word roi. I've done an entire program about the roi because this is something we've tried to work with in Jaipur, in Kishanbagh. But the roi is a word that is used by people who live in the desert in Western Rajasthan. And they describe the shrublands that are more or less old, intact vestiges of natural vegetation in the desert as roi or rohi, sometimes with an H in it. And we discovered that Colonel Todd traveling on camel from Sindh to Jaisalmer in 1829, actually remarks about this. He says the natural jungle of the desert is a shrubland that is called the Roi. Now, shrublands are something that you see in arid places all over the world. You see it in Australia, in the Mulga regions. Vast areas of Australia actually are shrublands. You see it in the Garrigue of the Mediterranean, where you get rock and you get salt-laden winds and you get, very small winter rainfall. You see it in the Fynbosch in South Africa. You see it in the chaparral in California. You see it even in cold deserts, where the cold also inhibits the ways in which forests and trees can actually grow there. So you get instead shrublands. So shrublands are in many ways the climax vegetation that you can expect in some of these very stressed areas. And the Roi, therefore, is for us a very, very valuable site of what are now very small remnant relict patches of natural vegetation that are left in the desert. And why are they scattered and small? Because basically nobody conserves them, nobody recognizes them to be valuable. The forest department treats the entire desert as being a wasteland, as being a useless place. Sorry, I'm getting some interference. Somebody needs to mute their mic.
Sorry, me. That was me. Sorry.
Oh, that was you. Okay.
I was checking the Facebook thing. Sorry.
Okay. So Roi is the last remnants of natural vegetation. And I'm just going to take you on a short journey to give you a sense of what are the kinds of plants that you see in the Roi. One of them is bui, which is a Airva, which belongs to the Amaranthus family. Bui is very, very common. It's also called desert cotton for obvious reasons. It has this beautiful white cottony look to it. The last remnants of natural vegetation. And I'm just going to take you on a short journey. Sorry, I'm getting my own voice coming over somebody's mic with a delay. Is that?
I think it's sorted. Yeah.
Okay. The other important plant is Keep, Leptodenia, which is a very much taller plant with leaves that remain on the plant for a very, very short time, because most desert plants can't afford to actually have leaves, can't afford to have transpiration happening in the desert. And Keep is something that actually grows on the edges of moving dunes, but is, again, extremely versatile, extremely important in the desert. And the third plant, Sinio, which is the Crotalaria, is, so these three plants, the Bui, the Keep, and the Sinio, this is also a picture of Sinio. The Sinio is small, this little yellow flowers, very, very tiny, and it tends to dry up in the desert like you see in the other pictures, and then becomes, very, very extensive. But these three plants were, for many years, I would be traveling in the desert and I would see these three plants forming these Roi-like habitats. And it wasn't clear to me at all what it was about these habitats that was, the habitats changed slightly as the minerals changed, but these three plants tended to be versatile enough to actually occupy these spaces, even if, for example, the sandstone changed to an iron-rich sandstone or to a limestone or to a much more rocky kind of habitat. And we became completely fascinated with these three plants in particular. And then if you happen to cross over into slightly more salty habitats, you got Lana, haloxylon, which is a plant that can take much greater concentrations of salt. And this is a picture of what Lana looks like in flowers, one of the most beautiful things that you can imagine in the desert. And again, it has no leaves like a lot of other desert plants, but it looks a little bit like a gymnosperm, as you can see in the picture on the right. Then you get the grasses. Now the grasses are hugely important in deserts, as you would expect. In forests, you will all be aware that grasses are not such an important part of heavily forested patches. You tend to see them in little patches between trees, Forests tend to shade out grasses. There are very few grasses that are actually able to survive and prosper in shady areas. But once you get, grasslands and open areas, that's when grass actually comes into its own. And there's a series of desert grasses, including panicum, which you see here, and savin, which I'm showing you here. Savin is regarded as being the second most nutritious fodder grass that there is anywhere in the world. It's now being collected, the seeds have been collected and being exported to the Middle East because it's now valued so highly as a fodder grass. And then you get Pennisetum divisum. You can see my friend Golak, who's about 5'4" standing on the left, and the grass is almost twice as tall as him. So you can imagine just how tall these grasses are. This is not a common grass. It's a fairly rare grass. We've only seen it in 3 or 4 patches, but it's an absolutely beautiful grass. And here it is. The grass is actually backlit by a rising sun. And whenever I go to these patches with Pennisetum in it, I just absolutely love it. Then you get shrubs, shrubby trees like the bhubawal, Acacia jacquemontii, which has little pom-pom yellow flowers, a little bit like the common babool does. But the babool, of course, is a tree with a single woody stem. This one is multi-stemmed and very bushy. And then you get another set of plants that tend to be pioneers. They will tend to be the first plants to occupy shifting sands when they're first irrigated by rains early in the monsoon. So these pale green, greeny blue plants that you see is something called Tephrosia falciformis, diamond, which is a pioneer, which the minute other plants will start growing close to it and giving it competition, diamond will put its hands up and say, "Main to chala yahan se," I'm not going to stick around anymore. But it performs a role in actually, because it's leguminous, it's actually adding nitrogen to the soil. It's beginning to bind a little bit of the sand, and it prepares the ground for plants that are going to follow. So these are some of the plants that you see in sandy areas. Oh yes, and then there is perhaps my all-time favorite, which is called Phog. Now, this picture that you see was taken with a drone, and it shows a Phog area, which has essentially only Phog and the bui, the paler plants that you see in this. This is the bui that I showed you earlier. But Phog or Caligonum is one of the most beautiful, hardy plants that you see in slightly salty dunes. They've now been pushed almost to the very extremes of the boundaries of the desert in India. You see it more or less all along the boundary with Pakistan, where people don't visit or not allowed to visit. It tends to be sort of in a line. But Phog is now highly endangered, partly because its wood is very high. It has very high calorific value, so it burns at a very high temperature. So you get this kind of scene where you get camel carts laden with the roots and lower branches of Phog, because they are used by sonars, by jewelers who want that extra heat, and by people who make coal, by koila workers in the dune. All right, so then when you move away from the dune, you get this very productive zone that is called the interdune, right? Now the interdune is, as the name suggests, it's a part of the desert that lies between dunes. It's got firmer ground, it's got harder soil. This is where you will get many of the animals, like the spiny-tailed lizard that make their homes in the interdune. And this is also where you can see very clearly here that the dark care trees that you see in the picture are only growing on the interdune. They don't actually grow on the dune itself. Now, so care is one of the absolutely delightful plants that you see in the interdune, in the desert, wanting that firm soil that you get on the interdune. And then you have what is in some ways the iconic tree of the desert. Now, because there are so few trees in the desert, this particular one is celebrated perhaps more than any other. It's called the Khejdi. And the Khejdi is, interestingly, the same genus as the invasive Mexican Vilaiti kikar that has caused so much damage in India. But yet this one is not at all invasive. But it has the picture that you see on the bottom right, which looks like the trees are actually holding hands. These are actually clonal. You can see that these are, one tree has sent a runner that has become exposed as some erosion has happened and sent up another trunk. So these three trunks are actually one tree, one individual, one set of DNA that looked like three trees. Now we'll meet some more of these clonal trees later in this PPT. And the picture above that shows you what's happened to a Khejdi that is growing inside a small seasonal lake called a nadi in the desert. And as the nadi has emptied out and some of the clay and the soil has got eroded, it's exposed all these wonderful roots, and it doesn't seem to make any difference to this tree because there is a record that a Khejdi with a 48-meter long root was once discovered in the desert. That may not be the fullest extent to which the roots can grow. That just happened to be one tree that somebody had actually run across. These are the flowers of the Khejdi. They're a great bee forage. I always say that you can actually hear a Khejdi sometimes before you see it when it's in flower because of the buzzing of the bees. It's just, the bees go absolutely punch drunk when they sense a Khejdi. But the Khejdi is also what you see when you drive through winter in the desert. You see these lopped Khejidis, and they lop them essentially to try and stimulate a fresh flush of leaves on the Khejdi because it's such a great fodder tree. This picture shows you how, this picture was taken about 120 kilometers southwest of Jaisalmer. And you can see how the Khejdi trees more or less space themselves out because they're really, they're sharing very scarce resources. And they wouldn't probably be able to survive if they were growing much closer to each other. So this is nature's way of actually being able to, make it possible for a tree that does make big demands on the land to grow in a way that is sustainable. Then you get the Pilwan, which is a climber that has a strange and interesting affinity with the Khejdi. There are parts of Rajasthan where you will not see any Khejdi tree that is not adorned with a thick vine of the Pilwan. And the Pilwan then goes and clambers up. It doesn't seem to affect the ways in which the Khejdi is able to photosynthesize. So both of them are actually able to subsist together. That's that beautiful fruit of the Pilwan, which looks like a slightly translucent ruby. Then you get the Suapug. Now Suapug is a much more rare plant. It's an ephedra, and therefore it's the gymnosperm, and it's the only gymnosperm that now remains in the desert, probably a very ancient remnant of a time when the desert was much wetter and much cooler. But as you can see in the picture on the top left, you can see that it forms two dome-like structures on top of a Matinus tree. And that's where it's flowering. And, like all gymnosperms, you have the males are separate from the females. This particular one is a female tree. And, but absolutely gorgeous plant. Then you get the two Salvadoras, the Salvadora oleoides and the Salvadora persica. I'm only showing you the oleoides here. But the persica is what is thought to be the mustard tree that is mentioned in the Old Testament, where there is mention of a mustard tree, and nobody quite knows what a mustard tree is. But because the fruit of the other Salvadora is slightly peppery, people think that it probably refers to the Salvadora persica, which has a natural range that extends all the way through the deserts into the Sahara and into Arabia. But the Mithajal does this very often. It has its branches not quite weeping, but the branches start very, very low down, which means that very often each little tree becomes a refuge for desert foxes and desert cats and all kinds of gerbils and rodents and reptiles. So that it's a really, really important part of the natural habitat of the desert. These are more pictures of what the Salvador oleoides looks like. It tends to have this very dense crown when it does rise above the ground. But even here in the top picture on the left, you can see how the canopy is crashed because the cantilever of the branches was not strong enough to actually hold it up. Then you get the Bordi. Now, many of you will be familiar with Ziziphus numbularia as a small tree that is called the jhadbeer or the jhadbeer, which is a small bush, at least in Delhi on the ridge. I never see it growing more than about 3 feet tall. But in the desert, this tree becomes a giant. This particular picture is taken in an oran, which is some of the one of the sacred forests that are preserved by villagers there. And you can see from the figure at the bottom right how big these trees are. These are 30, 40 feet tall. So it's obviously an ecotype, a particular strain of the Ziziphus numbularia, but very much the same species that behaves in a very different way once it finds its ideal biome, right? Then you have the Rohida. Rohida is celebrated by people who know the desert. It's the official state tree of Rajasthan, mainly because it flowers very beautifully in February and March. And you get flowers like this that, you can't help but seeing as you drive through, especially parts of Barmer, which is famous for its Rohida trees. Rohida is also famous for having a very beautiful wood. Not because the figure is so beautiful, but because it's very easy to carve, it's very light. It's called desert teak, and all the old wood blocks that were made in the desert were made from this particular wood. And again, here you get a whole range of grasses in the big, flat, savanna-like places that you see in the desert. You get something like 37, 38 species of grasses that inhabit the desert. You're seeing a range of them here. You're seeing some of the golf course-like effects that you get in plain land in the monsoon, which is a bit of an illusion because actually when you go up close, you realize that you get this deadly grass that they call bhurat, which anybody who has experienced bhurat and anybody who's walked through this kind of terrain will curse and curse because they're very, very prickly. They attach to your socks and to your clothes and to your trousers, and then it takes ages to get rid of them. But you also get this other lovely creature called the becario, which is one of the indigoferas. And interestingly, I asked somebody when I first encountered it, I said, why is it called becario? And they said, bina kare ho jata hai, isliye isko becario bolte hain. Nobody actually plants them. So the name becario is something that happens on its own. But the becario is famous because, this picture that I showed you, the previous one, the seeds can actually stay dormant in the desert for up to 10 years. So if it doesn't rain for several years, the seeds will not germinate. But when you get a good rain above a certain level, the becario will form a beautiful mat all across the sandy plain. Then you get what are called the hamadas. Hamada is another Arabic name that is used to describe basically plains that are essentially rocky, on which you either get only a little bit of shallow sand or from which all the sand is actually blown away. And it's the rocky parts of the desert that I've actually explored in some ways more than I have the sandy bits, only because the Rajodha Desert Rock Park that I was working in for 15 years in Jodhpur is a rocky desert. So I was more interested in the rocky desert than I was initially in the sandy parts. And as you can see from these pictures, there's a big variety of different kinds of minerals, ranging from sort of irons and various oxides of other, manganese and phosphorus and things like that, that actually give the desert so much color. This picture here, for example, is a picture of some low Jurassic hills with very iron-rich ferruginous sandstone. And on top of this, you get the savan grass growing in very separated clumps. This is very, very typical of this particular kind of habitat. This is more a sense of what the iron-rich sandstone looks like. This is something like 150 to 170 million years old, remnants of the sea, of the time when all of this was part of a shallow sea. And very often in these ferruginous sandstone, these iron-rich sandstone areas, you can either get to see the nodules like you can here in the top picture and in the bottom left, or you get much more what look like burnt, almost volcanic rocks, but actually are all just iron-rich, very dark rocks in these particular habitats. These are more pictures of the variety of dark minerals and the heavy minerals that you see in different parts of the desert. Very, very interesting. And this picture, which you may take a few minutes to try and understand, what looks like little feathers lying in the pebbles, is actually tiny little flowers, the flowering parts of a grass that is called Stipagrostis, which loves to grow in these hamadas, in these rocky places, and forms these absolutely gorgeous landscapes with, with grass. So you're seeing in these pictures, you can actually see the Stipagrostis at different stages of its growth. This is a picture of haloxylon, which also likes iron-rich sandstone, also likes to grow in slightly salty areas. This is a plant we discovered quite late in our searching, and we dug up 2 small plants that we found in an area where there was quite a lot of these plants, and we brought them back to Jodhpur, and we knew that we couldn't plant them within the park because we didn't have the right kind of soil. But we created a small pit and brought in its soil and planted it. And for about 2 months, the plant just remained like a yogi. It didn't move, it didn't prosper, it didn't die. And then one of them keeled over and died. And we thought, oh, we're going to lose the second one. But then the rains came, and this plant is now multiplied and done so well that you get, this is the plant in flower on the left, and that's the fruit, the ripe fruit on the right. Very, very tiny. But Dr. Bhandari, who was one of the authorities on the desert, had never described the flower before. He said, I've not seen it in flower. But now we have it in cultivation as a plant that actually does exceedingly well. And this is a lesson you learn, that you give the plant the minerals that it's used to, the minerals that it needs, and it does really well. This is another rocky habitat-loving lithophyte, Sedera latifolia. I'm not sure what it's called locally in Marwari, but this is a very common color in the desert, this kind of slightly pale bluey green. You saw this with the Tephrosia earlier, right? You see it again with Sedera, you see it with the buoy leaves, you see it with several plants. And that's because the paleness often has to do with the fact that the leaves are covered with fairly dense, tiny microscopic hairs, which do 2 things. They reflect the harsh sunlight, but they also trap a boundary layer of air next to the leaf, which actually shields the leaf from being overheated. And you get the Phagonias. There are 3 species. Well, if you count the subspecies, there are 5 subspecies of Phagonias that you see in the desert. Most of them will tend to grow again in rocky areas. One of them loves the sand, but again, a very pretty plant that you will see wherever you go in the desert. And you get the Lunwo, the zygophyllum, which is a succulent. Now, for reasons that I'm not completely sure of, we don't have a great many succulents in the Thar Desert. I was lucky enough to go to northeastern South Africa, where you have the Karoo and the little Karoo, which is almost like a showcase of the succulent plants that grow in deserts. And I feel very inadequate when you compare the succulents we have in the Thar with the more than 380 species of succulents that you had in the little Karoo. We probably have about 16 species or 20 species at most. But this is one of them, very small, very tiny, but very beautiful. Then we get into, I'm moving now from the, the iron-rich sandstone, which you see at the top here, to caliche and calcrete, which are basically limestone. I mean, it's got the same minerals as limestone. It forms in a different way from limestone. And these particular habitats are very characteristic of arid places where you get a seasonal rainfall. So this is these are, and you get a lot of it in the desert. Almost everywhere you go, you'll find instances of calcrete and caliche, like this one. And then you get plants that are brilliantly adapted to living in what is essentially fairly high pH soils. But this is the Safed Vajidanti, the Palaria, which absolutely loves to grow in caliche. This is a picture in a burial ground where you had chhatris, and because of the lime that had been used to bind all the rocks together, you had all these, all the Safed Vajidanti here in a dry state, waiting for the rains before it goes green again. One of my favorite trees in the desert is a tree called the Indrok, that grows in soils that has concretionary lime nodules or conker soil, right? And these trees grow in seasonal nadis with just a little bit of water flowing in the rainy season. And you'll be amazed to know that every single tree that you see here is linked underground by a runner. These are all probably one single tree, one and big clonal forest consisting of a single entity. And it also is, I mean, these are lopped because the leaves are used for fodder. But whenever you see an Indrok tree that is not lopped, you get these absolutely beautiful conical shapes. I don't think that I know of a more beautiful desert tree, anywhere that I've seen. These are the leaves. They're little round cup-like leaves, very, very beautiful. And you see the flowers at the bottom, and you can see part of the clonal forest on the right. Then you get limestone. Now, limestone, also calcium carbonate essentially, but is formed essentially from the bodies of shelly creatures in the sea. So it's precipitated limestone, precipitated calcium carbonate that actually forms. You will find fossils in limestone. You will never find fossils in caliche or calcrete. So that's one of the ways of telling them apart. And you get what are called desert pavements that you see on the top left, which is very typical of these limestone areas. You also get in these limestone areas, you get what's called forams or foraminifera, which are little single-celled creatures that can grow quite large because they form out of calcium carbonate. They form what are called tests, which are internal skeletons. And you can see this rock on the left, or this soil on the left, is absolutely chock-a-block full of forams. And forams are very, very interesting to scientists because it helps them to date particular marine habitats, marine rocks that are left behind in habitats. And they can actually tell almost to the tune of parts of a million what period these habitats belong to. Now I'm going to get a little bit more into rocky habitats, and just to give you a sense, not of every single kind of rocky habitat that you're likely to encounter in the desert, but some of the more important ones. The most important, of course, are sandstone, granite, and rhyolite on the left, right? Some of the other ones that you see are on the right, but even that is not an exhaustive list. Now, plants that grow in rock, we call lithophytes, right? Lithophytes, lithos means rock, and phyte means a plant. So plants that grow in rock are called lithophytes. but you get various forms of lithophytes. And one of them is called the chasmophyte. And as you can imagine, a chasmophyte is a plant that likes to grow in chasms, but in little chasms, which we call cracks, actually, cracks inside rock. And we'll come to that in a minute. But starting with sandstone, it's fairly simple to recognize sandstone when you see it. These are all slightly blown up, magnified views of the sandstone, the silica grains that you see in sandstone. But if you run your finger along sandstone, you will always feel that slight grittiness that will be a giveaway for sandstone, right? And sandstone is something that is mined in several places across Rajasthan. You get these, this is a mining scape that you see near Jodhpur on the top left. This is the old method of mining that you see in the top right, where you actually drive these pegs into an entire block of sandstone. And then a man with an extremely long, 6-foot long shaft takes a hammer and unerringly hits the peg every single time. It's quite fascinating to watch them. This is no longer used. Now the method they use is seen on the bottom left, where some sort of Chinese chemical whose composition is not clear even from the packets that it comes in is actually, they drill into the rock and they put this chemical down there, and the chemical expands and it basically breaks the rock apart. And that's how you get the usable, what are called the cheens or the chinias that they use. And this is, for example, in Jodhpur, the word cheen is used in Jodhpur. The word changes in different parts of Rajasthan. But what you're seeing at the bottom is a little installation that we made in Kishanbagh of all the different kinds of sandstone ranging over 1.2 billion years. I mean, the origins of the sandstone ranges over a period of 1.2 billion years in different parts of the desert. But these are the kinds of ways in which the sandstone is used, both as boundary fences and for all kinds of, for roof slabs and things like that. These are some of the sandstone habitats that you see in the desert. All of these are taken in Jodhpur. The one on the top is a kind of horseshoe-shaped sandstone in the Zanana Gardens, just outside Jodhpur city. And what is very interesting about sandstone, some people would say the most interesting aspect about sandstone is that it's highly fossil-bearing, and you get the earliest kinds of fossils of basically of the first complex creatures. The first multicellular creatures are found in a particular kind of sandstone in Jodhpur called the Sonia Formation. And what you're seeing here is a trace fossil, not a fossil of the hardened parts of a creature, but the movement that a creature has made in soft clay before this rock hardened. I don't have time to go into more of this, but I just want to tell you that basically scientists used to believe that the beginnings of hard part fossilization went back to the Cambrian period, about 545 million years ago. But they've discovered that, essentially about 15 years ago, that there's a previous period when you had multicellular creatures leaving behind traces of their existence. And this is called the Ediacaran period. So we have Ediacaran rocks that are found in different parts of Rajasthan, one of which is Jodhpur. And these are the kind of ichnofossils that you can actually see in sandstone. Now, the grasses love sandstone. They love sandstone. There are surprisingly more grasses that you find on rock than you find in sand. We've counted something like 74 species of grasses that are mentioned in Dr. Bhandari's book on the flora of the desert, and that may not be exhaustive. I've come across some Pakistani books that talk of at least 6 or 7 other species, which may or may not be found in India, but they're found in rocky parts of the desert. So very, very beautiful grasses. Then you get succulents like the kirkheep sarcostema, which forms these huge, beautiful, again, that pale light gray-green that we've looked at earlier. But you can see it growing in almost pure rock, right? There's no soil to be seen anywhere on the slope that you can see in this rock on the top picture. Now, one of the most remarkable grasses that you find in rock is a grass that is appropriately called rock grass. Now, Oropitium is an amazing grass because it actually binds soil together. It has a relationship with another creature called a liverwort, another bryophyte called a liverwort. And together they form a mat which keeps growing wherever you find a little depression in rock. And if you look at the picture on the top right, you can see how in this depression, basically the mud has flown in and Oropitium seeds have blown in, and now it's forming, it will protect the rock, the mud from blowing away. In the picture on the bottom left, you can see a V-shaped bit where, again, the Oropitium, so the bright yellow grass you're seeing is not Oropitium. These are other grasses that have come up because Oropitium has gone and bound this soil and given it a kind of homogeneity, right? So this is one of the most important grasses because if you didn't have this, then wherever you had rock, the rock would remain bare. But this is the grass that enables rock to become, it enables other things to grow on top of rock. Okay, then granite is the other great rock that you see in parts of the desert. It tends to be somewhat towards the eastern part of the desert rather than deep in the desert. But the granite is very, very beautiful in the way that it has these lovely, swirly, eroded forms that you see, almost wherever you go. And the difference between granite and some of the other magma-related, some of the other volcanic rocks that you see, granite always forms underground. So basically granite is formed by a seam of magma that finds a crack in the earth and grows either upwards or sideways, but cools when it's still inside the earth. And because it cools inside the earth, it cools very, very slowly, sometimes over thousands and thousands of years. And because of that, it forms very large crystals. And that's sometimes the only difference between this volcanic rock and other kinds of volcanic rock that are actually blown out of the caldera of a volcano. But what happens to these large crystalline structures when they are exposed? You get what's called onion skin weathering. And you can see how you get all these different layers that are slowly being weathered by the action of water. Now, how this weathering happens is actually quite a complicated business. I'm not going to try and explain it here, but that's what causes these wonderful sinuous shapes in granite. And it's also what allows all the chasmophytes, all the plants to actually grow in all the cracks that are formed in granite. All of these little creatures are chasmophytes. They all grow in the tiny little cracks. One of the odd things is that you wouldn't expect that the cracks would be as productive as they are. But two of the reasons why they are productive is that if you have soil that is blown into a crack, and basically typically the soil that is most easily blown in and will enter a crack will tend to be very tiny particles of clay minerals, right, which are more nutritious. They have more nutrients for plants. But once they've entered a crack, a plant growing in the crack doesn't get its soil heated by the direct rays of the sun, and it doesn't get basically dried or desiccated by the wind. And that's why cracks are so productive. And we, in the kind of work we've done in the desert, this is what we love to do. We love to actually look at these cracks and plant things in it because we know things will do really well inside the cracks. This is Chrysopogon, which is a great crack dweller. Both the picture on the right and the picture on the top left. The picture on the bottom left is a picture of a tree. It doesn't look like a tree in the picture, but it's a tree called the dhok, or Anogeisys pendula. And all of this is Anogeisys pendula. Now, you will wonder why, or what the connection is between these wonderful green trees and that little shriveled thing I showed you in the previous picture. Now, dhok is an amazing tree. In some ways, for me, it has lots of puzzling features that I don't fully understand, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. It grows only on the Aravallis, all the way from Delhi right down to Gujarat. The first bit about it that is puzzling is that nobody fully understands why it doesn't grow anywhere else. There's a small area where the Vindhyas cross the Aravallis in an east-west direction. You get a little bit of dhok growing there, but nowhere else. So that's the first bit of the puzzle. The second aspect is that it's the only tree that, if you can see the picture on the main picture here, it shows you a forest that is probably 95% only this one tree. So it forms monocultures, but it's a monoculture that's not been planted. It's a monoculture that is that is owed to the fact that it's a specialist, a habitat specialist. It's the only tree that is capable of growing on steep, rocky slopes. And the mystery here is, what is it that actually enables it to survive where no other trees are able to survive? And this is not an answer that anybody's been able to provide, me at least. And the other interesting thing about it is that when the dhok is actually, when the growing meristem is eaten or grazed by an animal, it then stays prostrate. So some of the trees that have grown up are not dhok, but all the low things that you see are all dhok. So dhok will then become small and cleave to the rock and become just this most beautiful plant. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that, we talked about clonal forests before with Indrok. Dhok also forms clonal forests. And Indrok and dhok both belong to the same genus, which is Anogeisys. And again, this is something that has not been explored by our scientists and our botanists and our microbiologists, but it's waiting. It's a mystery that's waiting to be cracked. Okay, I'm going to move now to Rahul. How are we doing for time, Anand? Are we?
We're good at 7:30. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We have one.
I'm going to move now to rhyolite, which, like granite, is basically made from magma. It's a silica-rich magma. But unlike granite, this is something that is blown out of a volcano. And there are parts of the desert, like this picture was taken in Jodhpur. So if you're driving up to the Mehrangarh Fort from Jodhpur city, you will come across a long set of cliffs on the right with these flat faces, which is all rhyolite. So rhyolite is very, very, is very distinctive. This is rhyolite being mined very close to Jodhpur in a place called Kankani. And we know exactly when you had volcanic activity in the desert. It's 751 million years ago, if you want to know, when India was still part of the, the supercontinent before it started journeying upwards. And rhyolite is very interesting. And again, because all our work in Jodhpur has been in a rhyolite habitat, we've come to know rhyolite very well, and we've come to know and appreciate the plants that like to grow in rhyolitic substrates, of which the main one is, well, there are two really. There's Thor, and I'll come to the next one after this. Thor is also a succulent, a giant succulent. It is often erroneously referred to as a cactus. It's not a cactus. There are no cacti that are not either North American or South American. All cacti are New World. There are no cacti that are native to the Old World. But because these particular euphorbias have found solutions to living in very dry, arid areas, that are very similar to cacti. They're called cactoid euphorbia. So they're cactus-like in their characteristics, but they're not actually cacti. You can see in this hill at the bottom right, how the entire slope is covered with cacti until the slope becomes a little steeper, and then you start getting doke growing with, not cacti, with euphorbia, with doke growing in the thor. The particular thor that you see in the bottom left is about 35 feet broad. So you get a sense of how immense it is. If I was standing there, I'd be less than half as tall as the thor seen there. These are pictures of its flowers and its fruit. The fruit, I like to say, have inspired the design of faucets that people use for taps. That's not really true, but that's just a gup that I tell people for fun. And then this is the other predominant lithophyte that you get in rocky parts of the desert, and particularly in rhyolite, which is the kumat, or the Acacia senegal, which has this very, very prolific way of flowering in spring, and very distinctive 3 spines as opposed to the 2 spines that most of the acacias in the desert have. These are some of the other plants that you get in rhyolite. You'll get Pilovajjadanti, which I first was told about this particular subspecies or this variety by the great Dr. Bhandari, who led me to a particular stand, which he said was the only stand in Rajasthan. And we collected some seed from there, and now this is growing all over, not just in Jodhpur, but many other places where the people have actually bought this plant from us. Then you get the Biani, this particular Tephrosia. You were introduced to an earlier Tephrosia which grows in sand, but you can see that Tephrosia has actually gone and colonized all sorts of different kinds of habitats. And the rat's tail grass, the Sehima, which does really, really well. This picture is actually taken in Rajoda Park, so you can, all these rocks are all rhyolitic, right? And what's called the bottle washer, Eniapogon, which also loves to grow in rocky habitats. Okay, now, before I come to the end, just a couple of other habitats. Salt. Salt is something that you get in just a few places in the concentrations that you see in, say, the Sambar area, right? And the red that you see, the pink, the dark pink that you see happens to be a bacterium that is adapted to growing in very, very high salt concentrations. And I believe that the red that you see on flamingos' legs actually comes from this particular bacterium. But there's a range of plants that we call halophytes, plants that are adapted to growing in salt, in concentrations of salt that are normally so high that they would be toxic for most plants. So these plants have found a way of actually flushing them out of their system such that they don't interfere with metabolic processes in these plants. Sueda is one of them. And the tamarix is another one that you tend to find in very many seasonal kind of streams in the desert. And Lani, the salsola, is another one of them. These are some of the smaller plants that are all brilliantly adapted to growing in salty habitats. There's Cressa, which we've never managed to actually bring into cultivation. I'm not sure why. Cressa on the right, but all the other ones are very easy to cultivate. Now, just to round up what I've been saying, there are the clay minerals. So China clay is one of them. One of the problems with clay minerals tends to be that the size of the particles themselves are so small that it becomes very hard for water molecules to become free enough to travel through this soil. So they are in effect very dry soils, right? So with clay, you often find that it's very, very hard for plants to to get a foothold in them. So whether it's Montmorillonite, fuller's earth, which you get in many, many places, which is mined as a, as something that is, that has commercial value, or even the simple clays that you get along little riverbanks, right? This is just nothing special in this clay, but it's just sorted clay near a seasonal stream. But if you go to a place like Barabag, which has seen thousands and thousands of years of one particular catchment, with it's a very big catchment actually. Barabag is a lake that houses all the chhatris of the previous rulers of Jaisalmer. It then has this very weird juxtaposition of these wind turbines as the backdrop to the chhatris. It's, old and new. But in the lake that you have thousands and thousands, perhaps millions of years of clay that have come together. And as a result, you get the biggest kejiris, the biggest bordis, the biggest desi babuls that I've ever seen anywhere. I mean, huge mango trees, huge oak trees, and this is out in the desert with an average of 4 or 5 or 6 inches of rain a year, and many, many years sometimes of no rain at all. And then when you go there, as the clay is driving, you get these, as the clay is drying up, you get these wonderful edges where you get the pinks of polygonon and you get the whites of heliotropium, and it's just absolutely delicious. So these are the last pictures I'm going to show you of this habitat, but I'm going to end with 2 or 3 pictures of some of the places that I've been involved in trying to rewild, just to give you a sense that this is what we've been trying to do. This is a picture of a rocky part of Rahul. I mean, the whole of the park is rocky, but this particular bit is particularly rocky. And this picture was taken in, I think it was taken in February, so long before all the trees are properly in leaf. And then this is another picture taken at a different time of the year, showing you basically all the plants that have come up since we started rewilding 15 years ago. It's taken that long, but it's now been a very successful journey. And then I have one last picture of the new project that we've been working on. So Rajodha Park is all about working in rock, and Kishan Bagh is all about working in sand dunes. You see the sand dunes at the back. These are an obstacle dune that are formed at the base of the Nahargarh hills that you see behind. And what we tried to do here was to basically reclothe these hills. These dunes were completely bare when we found them. And we tried to reclothe them with the plants that grow naturally in sand dunes in Rajasthan. Now, thank you very much. That's all I want to say, but I'm very happy to answer questions and to take this forward in any way you like, Anand.
Yeah. So please do take a sip of water, catch your breath. I'll get to the questions. There are quite a bunch. Yeah. So I would welcome all the viewers to, already there are a bunch of questions lined up.
Yeah.
But all the others also, you can please type in. Okay. So the first question is from, yeah, okay. First question is from Mona. How do the khejri trees propagate so far from each other? Is there?
I mean, the khejri basically has a legume and seeds. The seeds presumably are distributed by birds, by other things. I think that what would probably happen in a situation like this was that if a seedling was to fall too close to another tree, it wouldn't find enough nutrients to grow in that space that was too close to another tree. So that spacing sort of happens naturally. The spacing happens because the nutrients build up by distance.
Right. Next question is by Ronak Nambiar. Is the Pilwan, does it have a symbiotic relationship with the khejri tree?
Well, it's symbiotic in the sense that they obviously are paired together. It's part of the same community. I'm not aware of anything that it does for the khejri. obviously the khejri provides support for it. And the pilwan clearly prefers the khejri to any other kind of tree. But I'm not aware that it's a truly symbiotic relationship in the sense that they're doing things for each other.
Is the reminds of Kher Sangri of Rajasthan.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
There's a comment from Anvi which says that it reminds her of Kher Sangri of Rajasthan.
Yeah, so the sangri is the legume of the khejri.
Right.
And the kher tree that we've seen, basically the berry of the kher is what is eaten in the kher sangri. So the kher sangri is a combination of the kher and the khejri and the fruit of these two trees. Yeah.
The next question is by Deshbhushan Jain. He's asking that how can the desert land be reclaimed and usable for cultivation of crops and fruit trees?
Well, I think one of the big misconceptions is that the desert ought to be reclaimed or should be reclaimed. I'm one of those people who believes that the desert needs to be allowed to remain the way it is with its natural vegetation. And all our attempts to actually try and do things to the desert have failed in one way or the other. And whenever we try, and for example, the Indira Gandhi Canal brings water from the Satluj into Jaisalmer and, first into Hanumangarh and the area in the north, and then through Mohangarh and Ramgarh into parts of Jaisalmer district. And wherever the waters of the Satluj have entered, essentially you get a lot of leakage in these canals. And what's tended to happen is that the water has gone down into the subsoil and it's brought up the salts. So the net result of trying to water the desert is to bring up the salts and to make the desert far more unproductive than it would otherwise be. But there are, for example, one of the things that happens in the vicinity of the Indira Gandhi Canal is that the pog, which grows naturally and happily on tops of all these dunes, is clear-felled for agriculture. But this agriculture will not last even 10 years. The agriculture is a completely ephemeral activity. Strangely, the government has even brought in dam ousties and given them land in Jaisalmer and said, you live here now. We've taken your land away from wherever you are, which is terrible and unjust and awful. But to also give them this completely horrible land, and then to give them land that they think that they can cultivate and grow because they've got water, which is not going to last. I mean, the water will last, but the land, the productivity of the land is not going to last.
So yeah, actually there was another sort of joint question by Amruta, which mentioned that what are the effects of irrigation projects on desert flora and fauna? How has that kind of, and I would add to that as to the people also, like the camel species or the lifestyle of people, how has it changed because of the desert, the irrigation canals?
Well, look, Western Rajasthan is entirely a pastoral economy, right? These are people who essentially had camels and sheep. And now, more and more, if you drive into the desert, you start seeing these deep bore wells. They're mining water from sometimes as much as 400 and 500 feet below the surface. They're mining, this water is known as fossil water. It's water that's collected over millions of years. They're going to completely, empty the kind of groundwater that exists there. And the returns that they get on agriculture are very, very small. There is a particular kind of agriculture that is practiced sustainably in far reaches of the desert. It's called the Khadim system, where people have basically learned to harvest what little bit of rainwater there is in ways that they learned from a Persian system. The word Khadim is an Iranian word. And there are people who are actually trying to teach people to extend this method of farming. but that is completely sustainable and completely wonderful. But to try and mine groundwater from great depths and try and irrigate your land in order to grow the kinds of things that you would grow in, a very different kind of soil is self-defeating, is thinking only short term, and is bound to have very, very poor effects on the land and what you can do with the land.
Right. There's another question from Dviti. He's saying that the jar belo, for example, the bale, why does the form differ in different one second.
The bale, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the bale, jar bale. Why does the form differ so much in the depending on the topography or the any?
So this happens. It happens quite often that you will get a species that behaves one way in certain kinds of minerals or certain kinds of nutrients, but you give it a totally different set of circumstances, and it will flourish in a totally different way, and that's simply what happens. Nobody has studied this properly, but it's very clear that it is the same species. It's simply a different ecotype. And here it struggles, which is why it remains prostrate and small and, not very, whereas there it has no competition whatsoever. It clearly likes the minerals it's getting, and it does really well.
So there are two very interesting questions, one by Ronak and one by Anjali.
Okay.
I'll combine them so that, probably you can answer them together. Ronak is asking, how do you differentiate between the desert and the more savanna-like biome, because both savanna as well as desert have a lot of seasonal grass species? That's the question from Ronak. And Anjali has asked that vegetation-wise, what kind of seasonality do we see in the Thar, or in terms of trees or shrubs, in compared to other habitats?
Okay, so the desert, I mean, people use rainfall and evapotranspiration as ways of saying this is desert and this is semi-desert and this is not desert. But it's a continuum,
Right.
There isn't any sort of clear demarcation. If you go to places like Tal Chapar, for example, which are much more grasslands, it's very much part of the desert, even though it is purely a grassland.
Right.
It's got desert species in it. It's got all the character, the amount of rainfall that falls there would be very much within the parameters of what you regard as a desert.
Right.
But there is a continuum, and therefore there will, you will probably find that. So essentially, from monsoon forest to thorn forest to desert savanna and desert, there is a continuum. It would be really very hard to draw a line where one ends and one begins. It is very much that one shades into another one. And there are all kinds of different considerations that have to do with how much moisture a particular soil can retain. So you can have slightly more rainfall in a soil that retains less moisture, behaving, more desert-like than a soil that gets more rainfall. So all of those factors come to be. Seasonality is very interesting, actually. So basically, unlike, say, a monsoon forest that you get all over, say, central India, and in peninsular India, not counting the rainforests, what you get essentially is you get, this is a big topic, actually, but I'm trying to see whether I can find a way through it. So basically what you get is that you get trees coming into flower and new leaf in spring, right? This is something that people have been very puzzled about, because if trees are dropping their leaves as a response to drought, you've had your last rain, let's say in September, right? And so September, October, November, December, January, there's been no rain. By about January, February, trees are starting to drop their leaves. It's very clear why they're dropping their leaves. Why is it that trees are putting on new leaves, sometimes as early as the end of March, and more usually in April and in May, when you would actually expect the new leaf to begin only when the monsoons came? So this is something that has puzzled a lot of people. And the answer is that the way phenology or seasonality works in these monsoon forests is that trees count backwards from the monsoon because it's the only time when their ripe seeds have a chance of germinating in the ground. So they need to count backwards for their flowering period such that at the end of flowering and fruiting, when their seeds are ripe, they're ripe at the right time of the year, which is that single pulse of rain, which only lasts for 2 months, right? Now, what does that mean for new leaf, right? So new leaf will happen because a tree cannot afford to do without powering up when it's flowering. Flowering is so expensive in terms of energy being expended by a tree that it needs to actually start making its own food all over again. So you'll always get new leaf happening either simultaneously with flowering or immediately after flowering. And that's what explains why new leaf happens when it does in a monsoon forest. The desert is somewhat different. You don't get as much spring flowering as you do in a monsoon forest, although some of the trees like the khejri will definitely behave like that. Rohira behaves sort of like that, although you'll actually get, interestingly, some trees that are evergreen. So the Salvadoras are evergreen trees in a desert, which is very, very weird, you know? Now, in terms of smaller things, in terms of shrubs and bushes and your ground flora, obviously there is a very big epiphany of what happens in the rainy season. And then one of the most effective ways for a plant to survive in the desert is to contract its life only into those months when there is moisture in the ground. So for the vast majority of species in the desert, things will germinate with the first rains, rush through their life cycle, flower, fruit, drop their hard-coated seeds in the ground and disappear sometimes as early as November or December, and then wait as dormant seeds till the next monsoon. So that's the phenology of the desert, really.
But also to add to that, we also can have extended periods of drought. So it could be 2 years droughts, 4 years droughts, and the seed would be viable even after those long.
Absolutely. I was telling you with the Becario, with Indigofera cordifolia, that it can survive 10 years without germinating.
Wow.
Maybe more.
The next question is from Ashwin Baindur from Facebook. Yeah. He was watching it on Facebook, and his question is that, is there any plan to preserve the typical Roi habitat that you talked about, either through the forest department or any private initiatives?
Look, I mean, one reason we did Kishan Bagh the way we did, and you know, we're trying to. So my ambition with Kishan Bagh is to introduce the term Roi into the vocabulary that you and I use for the desert. It's not a word that everybody uses, but once you have a term for it, you have a concept for it. Once you have a concept, you know, you can hope that people will look for it, will photograph it, will visit it, and hopefully will conserve it.
Right.
But can we have any hope that our forest department will do it? And the answer is no. I mean, we don't have a forest department that has any respect for natural forms in the desert. But hopefully, you know, I mean, just as in America, the entire movement for clean water was actually powered by the recreational fishing lobby. Hopefully enough people like you and I who care enough for the desert, care enough for the Roi, will influence public opinion in such a way that they will have to take notice.
Absolutely. So that brings me to a very pertinent question, very similar to this, is that does natural monoculture make the groves susceptible to any disease or pathogens? That was, I think, in line with the Anogesis pendula.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I mean, I've not seen any signs at all of dhok forests anywhere. And whenever I know of one or hear of one, or I want to visit it. I first discovered a dhok forest very close to Delhi, I think in 2001 or 2002, and myself and my friend Joanna went to see it because a friend tipped us off, and I visited it many times thereafter. And it's been a very important part of my understanding of this very unusual tree and the way it works in this habitat. But I've never seen a degraded habitat of doak. I've seen places where doak has been butchered, where people, cut it because it has a very, it's one of the hardest woods in the world. It's apparently harder than hickory, which is the preferred wood that Americans use for hammers, for carving. So it makes great tool handles. So people actually will raid it to make tool handles and things like that. But I've never seen any vestige of problems in a doak habitat.
Right. So that brings me to, I'll combine again 2 questions because there are a whole bunch of questions. I hope you are going good. We can go for another 15 minutes.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, okay. So Anjali has asked that are there any species in the Thar which are also found in the Ladakh or that cold desert area? And Rohit has asked that any highly medicinal uses of the desert vegetation that you can mention.
Okay. So, no, I mean, the fact that Thar is a hot desert and that Ladakh's a cold desert,
right,
doesn't mean that things can cross over. But interestingly, you get ephedra, you get species of ephedra in both habitats.
Yes.
But they're different species.
That's Tibetica and this is...
Yeah, they're different species altogether. But you wouldn't be likely to get the same species. I mean, the conditions are much too.
What about any echinops in the desert here?
You get an echinops, but it's a different species again.
Right. Okay.
So, sorry, what was the second question about medicine?
Medicinal. Yeah, medicinal use.
Yeah. So I steer a little bit. I'm a little wary of medicinal attributes because if you ask a local person about the medicinal uses of, do you know that I cannot think of a single plant that I've ever asked a local person about, where they said, "Nahi sahab, iska to koi use nahi hai." I've never come across that. But it's very hard to distinguish between the reasons why people value a plant for its so-called medicinal purposes. Is it magic? Is it superstition? Is it real? Is it part of a materia medica? Is it proven? Is it not proven? I don't know, right? And therefore, I sort of I look at it as being a slightly gray area. And I say, well, everything is medicinal, all right? I mean, there are lots of papers written about lots of plants, right? So if somebody is interested, by all means, it's something that is worth exploring, but it's not something that I have been particularly interested in.
Absolutely. We have a fantastic question by Priyamvada, which says that just as we advocate conservation of rainforests for their resource richness, coastal ecosystems for their role on the shoreline, and wind protection, what can be advocated for the conservation of the desert? I think that's a fabulous question.
Well, I believe that one of the ways towards conservation of the desert is to begin to separate it into landscapes. I did a series of, I did 2 talks to the Forest Training Institute to foresters in Jaipur, precisely on landscapes, because I wanted to try and sensitize them to the fact that, look, you go to a place like Namibia and the whole country is a desert. And they're so proud of their landscapes and they write about it. They show you things. They've got naturalists hiding around every corner, And here we have a forest department that doesn't even consider anything worth looking at, forget preserving,
Right.
So it's only when you start loving your desert and being able to distinguish between things that you will start conserving it. So in the same way that people have done terrific service in trying to conserve, rainforests and other valuable parts of our biodiversity, the desert is something that's just been totally neglected. I mean, the desertification is used almost as a word that, as a gali, But the desert itself is actually a wonderful ecosystem with wonderful creatures and animals and plants and ecosystems that really need to be recognized and valued and visited and conserved for their own sake.
Mona has mentioned that she's from Kutch, and there's a big run desert area in Kutch, which is covered by salt. So
Yes.
any trees and plants from there that you can highlight?
Yeah, well, Kutch has very similar plants to some of these salty patches that you see in the desert. There's not a great deal of difference in the plants. So one of the, in the bunny, for example, the chief plant that you see is shrubby forms of Salvadora persica, one of the jars, right? But it's obviously one of the differences between the Kutch, I think, and I don't know Kutch well enough, so I'm saying this slightly hesitantly, is that you don't get the same kind of diversity in Kutch that you get in Rajasthan. You get vast areas which have pretty much the same kind of minerals and the same kind of ecological characteristics.
So if you don't mind me pitching in, I've been a little over there. Yeah. So the Dhordo, the White Run area is fairly kind of barren because it's very heavy in salt, yes, and the salinity is very high. But next to that, there are areas which have got great vegetation and same grass as well as angiosperm diversity as you've shown over here. Yeah. So yes, there is not directly in the White, the what they call as the run, Safed Run, but the other area, the Dhordo doesn't have that, but the nearby areas do have a lot of, in fact, the bunny grasslands, for example, are extremely diverse areas. Mm-hmm. The next question is from Rohit Chavan. He's saying that there have been plans of growing olive trees in Rajasthan soil. How good is it to cultivate a foreign plant in soil of Rajasthan?
It's always something to be done with great caution. We have discovered sometimes too late that, that when you bring in something exotic. See that we have an organization in Western Rajasthan called the CASRI, the Central Arid Zone Research Institute. And they have been far too willing to travel to Israel or to travel to places like that and say, Acha, what are you guys doing? You're growing olives, chalo hum bhi olive lagate. See now the olive, for example, is a Mediterranean tree. And it grows in Mediterranean climates, which are essentially climates of winter rainfall. Now, if you plant a winter rainfall tree in a summer rainfall place, what is likely to happen? I don't know. We'll have to see. But it's not a very clever idea, But in general, if you look at, for example, what Kazri has done in Rajasthan, for example, they have planted millions of what they call Israeli babul, which is an Acacia tortilis, to try and tie down dunes. Yeah. And they think of it as being a totally utilitarian project, which is that to have a moving dune that goes and covers roads is a bad thing, therefore you have to tie down the dunes. But what you see when you travel through Rajasthan is you see these stands of Israeli babul, under which nothing grows, no birds nest in it, no animal uses it as fodder, perhaps maybe camels to chew some of the leaves. But the dreadful looking things, the dreadful remnants of Kazris, in my opinion, completely, misguided attempts to try and do things. But in general, it is not a good idea to bring in exotic things of any kind. They've tried to grow grow Arabian dates in Jaisalmer, and that's probably not as bad. It doesn't stray as far from your natural flora as some of the other things do. But in general, I would say don't experiment with foreign things.
But there was a plan to have the palm oil palms grow on both sides from Jodhpur to Jaisalmer highway or things like that. Yeah, green greening the desert part.
Yeah. So, you know, it's very interesting. The road from Jodhpur to Jaisalmer, which is about 270 or 280 kilometers long, it's a great road because it's maintained by the border road people, you know, so it's got army functionality. And I've often wondered why they're not planting any of the trees that would survive there, you know. So you have a religious, you have a person from Pali who has a religious sanstha, and he's planted neems for the first 100 kilometers or so, right? And these neems, because they are not particularly happy with the kind of rainfall regime they grow in, they're all in tree guards, so they're not eaten, and they're all watered twice a week by tankers that come out from Jodhpur, and every single tree is watered, you know, and they still look miserable because they just are not suited, right? But you have both the jars, you have the rohida, you have the kejiri, you have so many trees which you see growing naturally without anybody watering them, without anybody giving it any nutrients. Why don't people plant those things, you know? So it just doesn't make any sense to me at all. But this is a legacy of the, you know, it's the way the forest department thinks, or rather the way it doesn't think, you know. One of my favorite stories is that I was, you know, I'm very familiar with a place called Pachmadi in central India, where the Satpura National Park was created in 1981. And a particular gate called the Banar Pani gate was created, from where the first national park director said I should plant some avenue trees so that when people are entering this most diverse of central Indian national parks, they see some trees, you know, as they're going in. So for the first half a kilometer or so, he planted some trees. And he must have racked his brains and said, well, what should I plant? This is such a lovely, beautiful, diverse place. You know what he planted? He planted eucalyptus trees. And, you know, so to me, this is completely mystifying. You know, these are people who've gone to the Forest Research Institute. They're in charge of national parks. They're, you know, it's just, what are they thinking of? How do their minds work? You know? And it's symptomatic of the way most people, there are some marvelous people in the forest. I've met some gems, you know, in the forest department, but there are one in every 200, you know.
Absolutely. There's a very simplistic question by Anushri. She's asking, how do you study the rocks in the desert area?
I rely on friends of mine who help me to understand. My interest in rocks is actually only about 5 or 6 years old.
Okay.
But I have a friend called Pranay Lal who wrote the brilliant book
Indica.
And he's one of the people I will often sort of take a picture and write to him and say, Pranay, what is this? Kuch to bataya. And then he'd ask me for the question, then I'll split a rock in two and give him an answer. But you have to, you know, if you don't know something, you have to rely on somebody who knows more than you, and then that's the way you build your knowledge.
So, in fact, I must at this point thank Pranay Lal to introduce me to Pradip, and you know, this talk happened because of Pranay's introduction. So, I must acknowledge that. Abhishek is asking a very interesting question: How do you see animal or avian life in the rewilding endeavors, right from rodents to top predators? Like, what's the time span of recovery?
Yeah, well, you know, in Jodhpur, one of my big regrets is not having done a baseline survey of birds when we first began. But we did about 4, maybe 5 years after we first began, we did a baseline survey, and we found something like somewhere between 40 and 50 species of birds in the park. But now it's over 200. In a tiny little island of 70 hectares in the middle of a city in the desert. You know, we're very, very proud of that. Because birds, of course, can find an island, you know. So if you have a biodiverse island with lots of different kinds of things to eat, birds will find it, butterflies will find it, perhaps grasshoppers will find it. But lots of things can't find it, you know. Lots of things will be prevented from actually finding a place like that. So you can get bird diversity and butterfly diversity doing really well quite quickly, it takes a lot of time for other things to happen. With Kishenbag, we're hoping to do, we started a bird count quite early. It's very low at the moment, but it'll be very interesting to see after 4 or 5 years what happens to the bird count in Kishenbag. We haven't done an entomological survey, partly because we don't know the right people perhaps, but it would be very interesting to do an entomological survey. And as well as a reptile survey. So if there are any people out there who can help us, get in touch, please.
Great. There's a last question. Of course, there were lots of comments, especially people saying brilliant photographs and really eye-opening presentation. And hope there's a book coming up on the flora of the desert. It's very similar on the lines of your Central Indian book. But Anushri has asked a very, very interesting question. Is that, and I've seen this myself also in Jaipur and many other parts of the desert area, people are now coming up with Miyawaki forests in the urban areas. What's your take on, because it's very irrigation intensive, so where there is huge water resource crisis?
So look, I have to be very candid about this. I've never actually gone and visited a Miyawaki forest to see for myself what it's like. I'm very suspicious of it. I don't actually believe that it's likely to be something that is worth doing. I think it's something that has come up at an opportune time. It's selling itself very well, and for people who have small factories and want to have tennis court sized intense gardens at the back, it's probably a great solution. But I'm not particularly attracted to Miyawaki forests for a couple of reasons. One is, look, it comes from Japan, which is primarily a coniferous forest area. Yes. You can get dense stands of conifers, but you don't get in a deciduous forest. So to have plants that are, trees that are planted 2 feet and 3 feet from each other, and to get dense woodlands like that make no sense at all to me, unless the object is to make them compete with each other in order to reach sunlight and therefore to grow faster. But that doesn't seem to be, Also, they're extremely expensive. If you were to look at, again, this is just based on hearsay and what people have told me, but the way in which they prepare the ground and actually provide nutrients and watering means that it's very expensive on a per square foot or a per square hectare basis. And they tend to be very small. We actually supply a lot of plants out of our nursery in Jodhpur to people who are doing Miyawaki forests, and I don't know why they're not growing their own plants, because there's no rocket science involved in them. But I'm not convinced, and I've seen pictures, I've seen several sets of pictures of Miyawaki forests. They don't look natural to me. They don't look as if they belong to anything that I know, They don't belong to any kind of ecosystem that I recognize. And therefore, I'm not comfortable with them.
Actually, in Jaipur, there was a team of people, some friends of mine donated money to this Miyawaki forest in Jaipur, and they're growing Polyalthia longifolia over there, and which is complete disaster, and I reached out and said, hey guys, you attend this talk and understand what you really need to grow. And, because I think I think everyone must have got a perspective, right from Delhi all the way till Punjab, Haryana, parts of Rajasthan, parts of even Madhya Pradesh. Wouldn't Chambal also qualify in some way as a part of the desert, some of the ravines?
Yeah, and there's a horrible plan at the moment.
Yes.
To clear fell all the ravines and to literally level them.
Yes. So thank you so much, Pradip, and thank you to all the audience to be putting up some interesting questions. I must thank Youthful India for hosting this session for us, and Dviti and Mahesh Samant, for Dviti specifically, he's been month after month hosting it for us, running it. It was absolutely fantastic, and with butterflies and some insects, I can help you. I think I'm pretty decent with it. We've done some surveys and other things a little here and there, but we're hoping that when we are in Delhi or in Rajasthan, once the lockdown is open, we can do a visit with you in these places and, actually see the landscape and have like maybe a day or two of real brainstorming and ideation that is there. Also, I don't know if you're familiar with the Aravali Institute of Management. Now it's a 100-acre campus on the outskirts of Jodhpur. And I've been a faculty there for 6 years. I can connect you with Mr. Varun Arya, who is a director. And definitely, I think something, another Roy or maybe a Uran can, probably come up, something like that. So thank you so much. And I hope the audience has already mentioned that it's been a very, very enriching session, a completely behind the ears kind of landscape, geographically very large, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
So thank you. And any more questions that are there, we will share. You can share it to us by email. If you couldn't for any reason, we will forward it.
Yeah, I'm willing to look at questions on emails, and if I find that I have time, I'll happy to answer some.
Can I share your email address here, Pradip?
Yeah, you can do it.
Yeah. So it's treesofdelhi@gmail.com. So this is a disclaimer to all the urban, planters, that please understand the local ecosystem, understand what you're trying to grow. The water, these are all resources. You will cause a lot of bleaching if you, unnecessarily add too much water in your landscape, which can't hold too much of water also. So please, my personal request that do write a book on the desert flora. I'd help you with the fauna part if possible. It will be a great partnership. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
And I'll be seeing you soon in Delhi, hopefully.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Good night, everyone. Please be safe.